He first broke out as the powerhouse lead voice for Melvin and the Blue Notes. But at the very height of their success, Teddy Pendergrass walked away, stepped into the spotlight alone, and his rise since then has looked almost impossibly smooth.
Have you ever stopped to wonder if some of the greatest male R&B legends men worshipped for their velvet voices, effortless charm, and explosive stage presence were quietly forced to pay a price the world was never meant to see? A price not counted in dollars, but carved into their own bodies. Chaka Khan has said she knows more than most because she saw where that truth lived. She heard the whispers behind closed dressing room doors. She wandered into hallways she later believed she never should have entered. And what she claims to have found was a hidden pipeline, the industry allegedly called the trade route, a shadow corridor, where young black male artists were rumored to be groomed, selected, and steered toward private auditions that had nothing to do with music. According to Chaka, a backstage assistant once stared straight into her eyes and said, "Nobody gets famous unless they pay one way or another." In that moment, she realized something chilling. Some R&B icons didn't simply rise, they were taken. 1. Marvin Gaye, 1977. 1981. The Private Nights in L.A. Chaka has said that when she was first told about the trade route, there was a list, not typed, not filed, never shown on paper in public. A handwritten roll call, allegedly passed from one whispering crew member to another backstage, naming young black male R&B stars who, according to rumor, had been pushed into arrangements no contract would ever dare describe. And when Marvin Gaye's name came up, she remembered the way people went quiet. His story, she was told, wasn't just tragic, it was the template. To understand why his name might have sat on that list, you have to go back to 1977. Marvin was collapsing, his finances were in ruins. His dependence on substances was no longer a secret. A brutal divorce had gutted him emotionally and stripped him bare professionally. The same industry that once revolved around his every demand was now, according to insiders, circling like predators sensing a wounded prize. That was when, people say, the strange invitations began. Band members later claimed they received late-night calls from private, unlisted numbers. Dancers whispered about limousines, with no plates idling behind alleys, engines humming in the dark. One tour assistant said she overheard a manager murmur, "He doesn't have a choice tonight. He knows what's required," and everyone in the room tried to laugh it off as twisted humor. Then came the night Marvin disappeared. According to studio staff, he left the building just after midnight, sliding into a black limousine with no bodyguards, no published schedule, no explanation. For the next 48 hours he was simply gone, missing rehearsals, ignoring calls, leaving musicians and crew scrambling to cover for him. When he finally returned, people close to him swore something fundamental in him had shifted. His eyes looked hollow, like he had stared too long at something he was never supposed to witness. His voice shook when he spoke, and when a keyboardist quietly asked, "Where'd you go, man?" Marvin reportedly clenched his jaw and muttered only, "I had to show somebody I was still useful." Days later, money for In Our Lifetime seemed to materialize from nowhere. New investors appeared, new support systems formed around him. Doors that had slammed shut in his face were suddenly flung wide open. No one in the room called it coincidence. No one truly believed it was. But the rumor that haunted people most didn't come from a musician. It came from a dancer who quit the business in 1983, saying what she witnessed in August 1979 still stalked her sleep. According to her account, Marvin returned from a late-night mansion meeting in Bel Air shortly after 2:40 a.m. on August 11th, looking like a man who had been stripped of something deeper than dignity. She claimed his collarbone was ringed with fresh bruises, uneven, finger-shaped, and the inner seam of his silk shirt had been ripped wide open, as if someone had yanked it from behind. What convinced her it wasn't just a fight, she said, was his face. Marvin didn't look angry. He looked ashamed, like a man who had been used. She described him standing frozen in a quiet hallway, gripping the torn fabric with both hands, unable to raise his eyes to meet hers. After a long silence, she said he whispered one sentence before walking away. "This is the price they said I had to pay. In her mind, that was the moment the rumors stopped being rumors and turned into procedures. She later told friends that Marvin cried quietly in the dressing room for nearly 15 minutes, shoulders shaking before wiping his face, stepping under the lights, and performing as if nothing had happened. Whether her story is true or not has never been proven. What mattered was the way it spread. By 1980, people in the LA studio circuit had stopped hiding behind code words. They weren't calling those encounters meetings, sessions, or auditions anymore. They began using a darker phrase, one that still clings to Marvin Gaye's late 70s career like a shadow: identity trading nights. Nights, according to the whispers, when a legend wasn't rising on his own, he was being lifted by hands no one wanted to name and no one was ever supposed to acknowledge. 2. Teddy Pendergrass, 1978. 1982. The Philadelphia Patrons. If Marvin's story was something people whispered, Teddy Pendergrass's story was something they dissected. In Philadelphia, insiders didn't just repeat his rumors, they studied them, line by line, like they were decoding a secret blueprint of how the industry really worked. Because unlike so many other artists, Teddy didn't simply rise. He blasted upward. Too fast, some insiders said. Too perfectly timed, and too heavily shielded by people whose faces almost never appeared in public. The first major red flag lit up in April 1978, right after Teddy's breakout hit turned him into Philadelphia's new golden sun. Practically overnight, he stopped moving like an artist on the come-up and started moving like a man under permanent escort. 3 older businessmen, always the same, 3 began showing up at every venue where he set foot. They weren't label executives. They weren't on his management team. They carried no visible credentials, and yet they walked through restricted corridors as if they had designed the blueprint themselves. Security guards later swore that these men never once showed ID. They would simply nod, and doors unlocked. They sat backstage in a tight formation, watching Teddy, studying him, sometimes leaning forward to whisper short orders that he followed without a word of protest. A makeup artist claimed she saw one of them grip Teddy firmly by the elbow, steering him into a locked green room. In that brief second before the door shut, she said Teddy's face went pale, the color draining like someone had just called in a debt. The most unsettling moment, according to witnesses, came after a show at the Civic Center. Teddy was sitting in a booth picking at a plate of fries when one of the men slid in beside him and murmured something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Teddy froze. His hands began to tremble. He pushed the plate away and said, barely above a whisper, "I know, I'm coming." From that night forward, people close to him understood one thing. Teddy wasn't rising alone. He was being taken. Crew members gave the 3 men a name. The Patrons, a rumored circle of wealthy Philadelphia elites, who, according to whispers, offered Teddy cash infusions, private performance spaces, and even political cover. But in return, the story went, they expected something far more intimate than a signature or a thank you. A former security guard described what he saw with disturbing precision. He said Teddy would be summoned to penthouse conference rooms late at night, usually after rehearsals, told that investors wanted a quick conversation. But the spaces he entered never looked like real business meetings. No paperwork spread across the table, no briefcases, just lowered lights, velvet chairs, thick silence, and men waiting. The guard remembered one particular night following Teddy toward a suite on the 22nd floor of a downtown Philadelphia hotel. Before he could step inside, one of the patrons blocked the doorway with a single hand and said, "He goes in alone." Teddy didn't argue. He didn't ask for backup. He didn't even glance over his shoulder. He just walked in, shoulders rigid, like a soldier answering a summons he didn't have the right to refuse. 2 to 3 hours later, the pattern was always the same. Teddy would emerge with his shirt creased, tie loosened, eyes heavy. What struck witnesses most was not just how tired he looked, it was how silent he became, as if someone behind those doors had handed him a secret so heavy it pinned his voice to the floor. And yet, every time one of those nights passed, the morning after brought something almost miraculous. Concerts suddenly sold out in minutes. Venues bumped him into larger halls. Radio spins doubled. New investors appeared. New opportunities materialized. There was no visible trail of paperwork, no public explanation, just results. The most shocking rumor came from a background singer who later walked away from the music business altogether. She claimed Teddy once slipped into a dressing room after a patron meeting and finally broke down. According to her, he collapsed into a chair, tears streaming, and managed to say only, "They own tonight, and they own me until they decide otherwise." It was a sentence she said she never erased from her mind. By 1981, even the Philadelphia press seemed to sense something beneath the surface. They couldn't print the full story, not directly. But they began using coded phrases: private benefactors, discreet investors, elite sponsorship chains. Inside the industry, everyone translated those words the same way. They meant the patrons. Men whose money, people said, built Teddy Pendergrass's throne, and whose power, according to rumor, demanded pieces of Teddy himself in return. 3. David Ruffin, 1966. 1971. The Detroit Arrangement. David Ruffin's story was never told in soft tones. It wasn't something people whispered or analyzed from a safe distance. It was something older Motown musicians warned about. They used to say, "If you want to understand Detroit nightlife, follow Ruffin, but don't follow him too far." Because in the late 60 seconds, Ruffin wasn't just a star. He was a beacon drawing in some of Detroit's most dangerous, influential, and morally flexible men. Long before any rumor about him took shape, Ruffin already carried a reputation: unpredictable, electric, seductive, spiraling. And those traits, according to Motown insiders, made him the ideal target for one particular Detroit kingpin, an underworld figure whose name never landed in print, but who was believed to control half the city's after-hours clubs. The rumor itself was brutally simple. The kingpin, people said, protected Ruffin's place in the Temptations. In return, Ruffin allegedly provided companionship, compliance, and whatever else the arrangement demanded. One backup singer claimed she lived through the night that confirmed every whispered story. After a sold-out show at the Fox Theater in October 1967, Ruffin didn't head backstage to celebrate with the group. Instead, she said she watched him slip out a side alley door at 11:46 p.m., walking fast, head down. Waiting, there was a gleaming black Cadillac, no plates, dark-tinted windows idling in the shadows. No bodyguards, no bandmates, just Ruffin and the car. The Cadillac, according to her, sped toward Detroit's east side, where a notorious nightlife kingpin was rumored to run a private lounge behind an unmarked brick wall on Hastings Street. Only criminals and celebrities ever seemed to enter that building, and never through the front. Ruffin did not return until 5:23 a.m. When he finally stepped back into the rehearsal room, the singer said he looked nothing like the man who had owned the stage hours earlier. His shirt hung open halfway down his chest, collar bent, one sleeve torn at the seam. His skin was pale, his hands shook, his eyes wouldn't focus. She insisted it wasn't the look of a man coming down from a wild party. It was the look of someone who had been claimed, not entertained. And everyone who saw him that morning, she said, understood one thing. He hadn't met a ghost. He had served one. Another dancer added her own detail years later. She said Ruffin would sometimes arrive at rehearsals wearing expensive jewelry he clearly couldn't afford on his own heavy chains. Gleaming rings, gifts she assumed were tokens from the kingpin. When she once joked about where the necklace came from, Ruffin reportedly smirked and replied, "It came with a night I don't want to remember." The pattern, according to those who watched, repeated for years. Ruffin would vanish after concerts, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for entire nights. He'd come back agitated, sweat-soaked, snorting, pacing the room, refusing to answer questions. If someone pushed too hard, people said he'd snap, "Don't ask me where I go, you don't want to know." But the darkest rumor came from a studio engineer who swore he once saw the kingpin grab Ruffin by the jaw in a quiet corner of the studio, locking his face in place and hissing, "You sing because I let you sing." The engineer claimed Ruffin didn't fight. He didn't even raise his hands. He just nodded. That moment, according to those who heard the story, made it clear the arrangement wasn't voluntary anymore, if it ever had been. By 1971, when Ruffin's chaos finally caught up with him and he was pushed out of the Temptations, Motown employees said the Kingpin simply shifted his attention to someone new, as if Ruffin hadn't been a superstar at all, but just a seasonal possession. In Detroit circles, they still call it the arrangement, a word that doesn't describe a deal, it describes a trap. One Ruffin stepped into looking for power and walked away from, with pieces of himself missing. 4. Rick James, 1979. 1984. The Mansion Nights. People who worked around Rick James in the early 80s said his house wasn't just a mansion, it was its own ecosystem, a private world with its own rules, its own currency, and its own hierarchy of power. And buried somewhere inside that world, according to relentless industry gossip, was a secret the business never printed, but everyone repeated. Rick didn't just host the parties. He allegedly served the people who paid for them. The whispers began during the peak of his excess. Cocaine dusting the air, velvet suits, neon lights, doorways that seemed to open into darker doorways. Rick moved like a man convinced nothing could touch him. But that illusion, insiders later claimed, carried a price he never wanted anyone to see. One dancer from his tour described the night she believed the fantasy cracked. She said Rick disappeared into a locked room with 3 VIP investors, men who, according to production staff, had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into his shows. There was no security posted outside, no manager waiting in the hall, just a closed door and silence. When the door finally opened nearly 90 minutes later, Rick stumbled out. His hair was tangled, his shirt hung open to his stomach, and on his face was a dazed half-smile that, she said, didn't match his eyes at all. He didn't look high to her. He looked used, like whatever had happened in that room had not been his idea. Another rumor painted an even more unsettling scene. A sound technician claimed he once walked into a side room in the mansion and saw Rick kneeling beside a sofa, while an investor stood over him, lecturing him about gratitude. The technician said he turned and walked away before he saw anything else. He didn't need details. The implication, he insisted, was crystal clear. People weren't coming to Rick's mansion just for pleasure. They were coming because they believed they owned a piece of him. And then, as always, there was the pattern. A mysterious gathering in the back wing, Rick vanishing behind a closed door. A long night of disappearances. Then Rick, emerging exhausted, pale, unfocused. Exactly 1 week later, almost like clockwork, money would appear. Funding for a massive tour materialized from nowhere. New staging, advanced lighting setups, fresh deals. No questions asked. No contracts made public. Insiders started calling the mansion the Deal House because everything inside it seemed to obey a single rule. Rick entertained the men who financed him, and in return, they kept his empire standing. Whether those entertainments were freely chosen or quietly coerced, nobody on the inside wanted to be the one to ask. What frightened people most wasn't the rumor itself. It was Rick's silence. Whenever someone even hinted at the VIP wings or asked about the investors who arrived after midnight, Rick would shut down. He'd drop his gaze to the floor, lower his voice, and say, "You don't want to know what happens here." And for many who heard him, that was the clearest confirmation they were ever going to get. 5. Al B. Sure. 1987. 1991. The New York VIP sessions. Al B. Sure. Entered the late 1980s like a controlled explosion, smooth voice, perfect smile, a kind of beauty that made executives lean forward the moment he walked into a room. But behind that polish, insiders said, followed a rumor so persistent it still lingers in New York studios decades later. Pretty boys don't get famous for free. His rise, according to those who watched it closely, felt too clean, too sudden, too precisely engineered to be explained by talent alone, and that was when the whispers began. It was said that Al had been pushed into a series of VIP sessions with older, powerful investors, men rumored to hold the financial keys to his albums, his videos, and his visibility. One producer described the first moment things felt wrong. During a crucial recording week, Al was invited to meet a wealthy patron at a midtown hotel. Not for lunch, not for negotiations, just a private approval. He went alone. No manager, no label representative, just him and a man old enough to be his father. What happened inside that room was never described publicly. But what followed was impossible to ignore. 3 hours later, Al reportedly emerged with reddened eyes, flushed cheeks, and his tie missing. He didn't speak to anyone. He walked past the staff without acknowledgement, got into his car, and vanished for the rest of the night. The next morning brought what team members later called the $500,000 miracle. Overnight, the label announced a dramatic expansion of Al B. Sure's video budget from roughly $350,000 to more than $700,000, approved at 7:12 a.m., less than 9 hours after he had left that hotel suite. There were no meetings, no paperwork trail anyone could find, no explanation. Exactly 6 days later, 2 unknown investors appeared on the official roster as strategic partners. Both men were in their late 50s. Neither had any prior connection to the label. No one had seen them before, and by 1992, no one would ever see them again. But the money they injected took effect immediately. Radio programmers said they received priority requests to increase spins of Al's single by nearly 40%, an unheard-of jump for an artist who had been struggling for airplay just days earlier. MTV and BET, networks that had passed on him for months, suddenly booked multiple interviews and placed his video into heavy rotation. Insiders said it felt less like promotion and more like someone had pressed a hidden switch, forcing the entire industry to move in unison. And everyone noticed the timing. The pattern kept repeating. A private meeting, a disappearance, a drained expression, then a sudden career surge. Again and again, until even the most skeptical engineers began quietly connecting the dots. One backup dancer later added a detail that chilled people who heard it. She claimed Al once admitted, after too much champagne, that an investor demanded he prove his dedication in ways he didn't want to describe. When she pressed him, he shook his head and whispered, "This isn't talent, it's payment." By the early 1990 seconds, a phrase began circulating through New York studios: "The price of pretty boys." It became shorthand for an unspoken reality. Handsome young R&B singers weren't just competing for fame. According to rumor, they were being hunted for it. And Al B. Sure, those closest to him believed, paid that price more than once. 6. Johnny Gill, 1,991,993. The Beverly Hills closed-door deals. The strangest thing about the rumors surrounding Johnny Gill wasn't how they began. It was how quickly they started to feel believable. One moment he was a rising solo star, struggling to keep momentum. The next, he was appearing in rooms only men with leverage or something to hide ever entered. Hollywood had its own quiet rule, people said. When an artist's career stalls, the vultures arrive first, and they don't come to negotiate. According to long-running industry gossip, a discreet circle of wealthy Beverly Hills businessmen began circling Johnny the moment his sales dipped. They were older, impeccably connected, and known for reviving stalled careers, never for free. A producer once put it bluntly, "If they take interest in you, you're already in trouble." A stylist later described a night at the Beverly Regent Hotel that became the backbone of every rumor that followed. Johnny was summoned to Suite 1203. No label representative, no manager, just a vague message about career opportunities. She said she caught only a brief glimpse of what happened next, but it was enough to stain her memory. Hours later, Johnny stepped out wearing only a long coat. His chest was bare, his shirt was gone. His skin was flushed as if he had been through something he couldn't explain. When their eyes met, he whispered, "Don't ask me. Please don't ask." Then he disappeared for 2 days. Exactly 1 month later, Johnny Gill's career seemed to resurrect itself. He was suddenly booked for a national tour, premium venues, prime scheduling, heavy promotion. The label bragged about new partners, but no one could ever name them. It was as if the money had fallen from the sky or from a penthouse deal nobody wanted to admit existed. Years later, a former personal assistant reignited the rumors by speaking about what she called the Beverly Circle, a group allegedly fixated on artists with strong physiques and vulnerable careers. She claimed Johnny once returned from a meeting shaking so violently he couldn't hold a glass of water. When she asked what happened, he said only, "They pick you, and once they pick you, you can't say no." Tabloids eventually labeled these encounters Johnny Gill's silent nights, because he never spoke about them, not in interviews, not with friends, not even with bandmates. And in Hollywood, silence has always been the loudest answer. The question people still ask isn't whether those meetings happened. It's what Johnny had to leave behind in those rooms so he could walk back out. 7. Charlie Wilson, 1982. 1987. The sponsor whisper. If Rick James had a mansion and Teddy Pendergrass had patrons, Charlie Wilson was said to have something even more unsettling, a shadow. Not a visible entourage, not a public benefactor, but a presence that followed him quietly through every phase of his early solo career. And according to people who worked closest to him, that shadow belonged to a single unnamed power figure who kept Charlie within reach for years. The rumor didn't begin with gossip, it began with fear. Bandmates claimed Charlie would receive short, untraceable phone calls during rehearsal. The voice on the other end was described as cold, direct, commanding. Charlie would go still, pack his things without explanation, and vanish for entire nights. No warnings, no excuses. Just a look in his eyes that made it clear whatever awaited him wasn't optional. One drummer recalled a moment during a 1984 tour stop that still made seasoned musicians uneasy. Charlie disappeared again after sound check. When he returned the next morning, he was so exhausted he could barely stay upright. His hands shook, his voice trembled, and he seemed genuinely terrified that someone might ask where he'd been. When the drummer finally did, Charlie snapped, "Don't ever ask me that again." He wasn't angry. He was scared. And yet, the pattern never broke. Every time Charlie vanished for one of those unexplained nights, something extraordinary followed. Dead contracts were suddenly revived. Labels that had stopped calling rang unexpectedly. Tours expanded. Deals that had already collapsed were mysteriously restored. No one ever saw who was pulling the strings. They only knew whoever sponsored Charlie had the power to move the entire industry quietly, instantly, and without resistance. The most chilling detail came from a wardrobe assistant who claimed she once saw a black luxury car pull up behind a venue. Charlie stepped inside. She said she moved close enough to glimpse the sponsor grab Charlie by the chin, tilting his face upward as if inspecting property, and whisper something she couldn't hear. But Charlie's expression said everything: shame, fear, surrender. Within industry circles, people began calling this unseen force the whispered sponsor, a name born from the way Charlie would flinch whenever someone came close to speaking it aloud. Nobody dared ask what Charlie had to give. They only said one thing with certainty. Charlie Wilson didn't just survive the 1,980 seconds. He survived someone. 8. Keith Sweat, 1,987, 1,992, after-hours agreements. Keith Sweat didn't climb the charts the way others did. He glided, smooth, effortless, almost suspiciously synchronized with the nightclub scene that crowned him. And according to people who watched it unfold, his ascent wasn't powered by radio alone, but by a network of club owners who expected something far more personal than gratitude. The rumor took root in New York's underground circuit, where promoters spoke in half-sentences and bartenders traded secrets like currency. They said Keith didn't just headline clubs. He belonged to them not by contract, but through what the industry quietly labeled favors. A dancer from his tour described noticing the pattern early on. After long shows, when venues normally closed around 1 a.m., Keith stayed behind on certain nights. Staff would clean the floors, dim the lights, dismiss security, and Keith would slip into a private lounge with the owner. No entourage, no witnesses. Hours later, he'd emerge drained, shirt untucked, eyes distant. And without fail, his songs would surge up the radio charts the following week. The most disturbing rumor surfaced in 1990. A club bouncer claimed he saw Keith cornered by two owners inside a locked VIP room, forced into a deal he had no power to refuse. He said Keith didn't look drunk or high. He looked broken. When Keith finally left the room, hands trembling, face pale, the bouncer asked if he was okay. Keith reportedly whispered, "If I don't give them what they want, none of you will ever hear my music again." The consequences were immediate. A single that had barely been promoted suddenly became the most requested track on urban radio. DJs who had ignored him began spinning it hourly. Club owners across the East Coast booked him into premium slots. Within Keith's touring circle, a phrase became common: after-hours agreements. It wasn't used jokingly, it was used like a warning. When Keith disappeared after a show, no one asked questions. When he returned, wrinkled, exhausted, distant, no one offered comfort. And when he said, "They're expecting me," nobody dared ask who they were. 9. Cisco, 1999. 2002. The Dragon Deals. Cisco's rise was explosive, chaotic, and unnaturally fast. Thong Song wasn't just a hit, it was a detonation. And whenever something explodes that quickly in the music industry, insiders begin asking the most dangerous question of all: who paid for it? The rumor pointed to two powerful music television moguls, men who allegedly controlled early 2000s video rotation like puppet masters. According to whispers, they didn't just support artists, they owned them. And when Cisco's star began to burn, they allegedly decided he would be their next investment. Industry gossip claimed Cisco never got the chance to say yes or no. They chose him. That was enough. During rehearsals for his world tour, Cisco suddenly vanished. No one saw him leave. No one was told where he went. 6 hours later, he stumbled back into the studio, drenched in sweat, shirt twisted, face flushed bright red. The choreographer said he looked shaken, like he'd been through something physical and humiliating. When asked if he was okay, Cisco muttered, "Don't talk about it, ever." Then came the miracle. His video budget skyrocketed overnight. MTV and BET rotations doubled. Executives who had ignored him suddenly begged for exclusives. It felt supernatural, too supernatural. A wardrobe assistant later added a detail that electrified the rumor mill. She claimed Cisco once returned from a private rooftop meeting with the two moguls smelling of chlorine, clothes damp, as if he had been pushed into a pool during the encounter. She remembered him staring into space and whispering 4 words: "The dragons made their choice." That phrase stuck, not because of his dragon-themed image, but because insiders began calling those disappearances Dragon Deals hours, when the industry's most powerful figures allegedly chose who would be blessed and who would be devoured. Cisco's fame didn't rise, it erupted. And eruptions always leave burn marks on someone. So now, after every whisper, every disappearance, every closed door these R&B legends were said to endure, one question remains. Do you really believe they rose on talent alone? Or was something far darker pulling the strings behind the scenes? Chaka said she didn't share these stories to provoke drama. She said it because, according to her, the industry still runs on unspoken bargains. And if this could happen to the greatest voices of their generation, what do you think is happening to the next? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well.